We have discussed international environmental law with a focus on MEAs, but these are not the only sources of law relevant for conservation. I want to talk about two other aspects of international law: principles and human rights. I already introduced the concept of customary international law. A few key environmental principles have achieved the status of customary international law, meaning they are legally binding outside the context of a particular convention. One of the oldest recognized environmental principles is the Territorial Principle, which says that states have the sovereign right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental and developmental policies, and the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. In other words, a state can mostly do what it wants within its territory, as long as it doesn't hurt other states or areas outside its territory. Sometimes this is referred to as Principle 21, because it is clearly stated as the 21st principle of the Stockholm Declaration of 1972. The precautionary principle is another important example. This principle says that where there are threats of serious irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Put another way, you can't decide not to try to prevent serious environmental damage just because you're not sure. This principle is stated in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development of 1992. A relatively new principle recognized in international law is the principle of intergenerational equity, which describes an obligation on present generations to act as custodians of the earth for future generations. The last topic I want to address in the context of international law is human rights. Human rights, like international principles, may be part of customary international law, though they can be stated in international agreements, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. Human rights can also be stated in declarations, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The definitions of human rights are elaborated and clarified by human rights tribunals, such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Many well-established human rights are closely related to conservation of the environment. In some cases, protection of the right to life requires addressing environmental harms that create lethal threats. The European Court of Human Rights has found that governments have a duty to address serious environmental threats from any activity, whether public or not, in which the right to life may be at stake. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights has found that the human right to life is implicated where environmental contamination and degradation pose a persistent threat to human life and health. Human rights are often invoked in cases involving indigenous peoples. Multiple international instruments recognize peoples' rights to self-determination and control over their natural wealth and resources. Development in their territory, and particularly removal of a people from their territory, requires their free, prior informed consent. This has also been connected to rights to property. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has found that indigenous peoples have rights to ownership over their traditional land, and that states should take special measures to secure such ownership. There is an emerging discussion of a human right to a clean and healthy environment. Such a right could include procedural and substantive components. On the procedural side, it could incorporate rights related to access to information, public participation, and access to justice. On the substantive side, it could include obligations to meet minimum standards for environmental quality. The questions of whether such a right exists and what content it might contain are being investigated by the UN Special Rapporteur.